Third and final video for the Absolute Monarchs section of our Absolute to Monarchs Age of Enlightenment and French Revolution unit is going to be on the Absolute Monarchs of England. Now, we saw how the Absolute Monarchs of Spain and France have been able to take and hold that absolutism and rule their people kind of, for the most part, without a whole lot of complaints or at least cause any issues for those different kings. But we'll see how England is different. And remember, the major difference that England has is that England has parliament. And Magna Carta, written in 1215, has put in some checks on the King of England's power. They really haven't been used a whole lot, but we'll see when the nobles of England and to a lesser extent the common people begin to become upset with the absolute monarchs of England, how Parliament, being that check on the King of England's power, is going to have a different outcome for the age of absolutism in England than what we saw in some of the other countries. So what we'll see here is the power struggle over really one major question. And the question is, what type of government does does the Kingdom of England want, or the Kingdom of England need? Now, when we say this, we're not talking about like we talked about the different types of government in our Greece unit, aristocracy, oligarchy, this stuff. Really, the only idea of a government is a monarchy. But the question becomes over who has the power, who has all or most, or where does the power lie in the government that the Kingdom of England has? Should it be with the Parliament? Should it be with the King? Now, if you're talking to the King of England's idea is that he is an absolute monarch. He rules by the divine right of kings. And so, even though the Magna Carta was signed by King John in 1215 and his laws on the book, and you can't just go take this away, the King of England have since 1215 looked at the Magna Carta and said that this has checks on our power, but the King of England is still higher, quotation marks, is above the institution of Parliament. And therefore, what the King says still goes for most of the power structure within England. Parliament, however, has a different idea, and this is the major difference between what we saw on the continent of Europe in terms of absolutism and what we'll see here in this video on absolutism on the island of England. Parliament's idea is that the Magna Carta has made Parliament equal to the King. Now, this is a development idea that's been development over time, that the King is not above Parliament. The King is working with Parliament. They're two branches of one government, and therefore the King and Parliament have to work together, and Parliament can and should and will place checks and try to reduce the King's power when, in Parliament's view, the King is working against the um, kind of goals and desires and wishes in the people of England. Now, this question begins to bubble up because of problems that are political, financial, and religious in nature dealing with the Stuart kings of England. Now, the four kings of England that we're going to rattle off here today are James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II. We're not thinking of this as like a James sandwich with two pieces of James for the bread and then a Charles filling. So the issue that the Stuart kings are having, and this is again stuff that's been percolating in England for a while, but it's going to come to a head here with these four kings, is does the King of England actually have the divine right of kings? Is he only serving because God has put him there? Is he only serving because of the grace of Parliament and the people of England? The lavish expenditures of the Stuart kings drawing down on the pocketbooks of the country of England, causing undue financial hardships on the people. We again see the problems of religion and the effects of the Reformation still playing out here, just like how we saw in France on the continent, where you have closet Catholics. Remember, England has turned over to become Protestant and Anglican, but those Anglicans have been trying to get those Catholics out. But again, you can be Anglican in public, but still be Catholic at your house. So trying to go that versus the Puritans, who are increasingly becoming a major political and religious power in England, who want to purify and still criticize the Catholic Church. England's running into wars with Spain and France. They're dealing with an Irish rebellion. So that's obviously costing a whole lot of money that they're having to deal with. To help pay for or at least make these military expenditures lessen, the English kings are quartering soldiers in people's houses, meaning that you are required as a private citizen of England to have a soldier who you have no idea who it is. It's just some guy from the army who's now living in your house. And remember, you got to feed and water them, but that's just not simply going to the uh, pantry and pulling out a box of Cheerios and giving them a quart of milk. You got to milk the cows, you got to pump the water, all that stuff. And again, in uncertain times and places, the English kings have delivered martial law, a military law, and we all know that martial law, military law, is much harsher with stricter rules and harsher punishments than, say, English common law does. On top of this, England is running into problems against Spain. They're forced to pay war reparations to Spain. So England's national debt is increasing and rising. So this is all coming up to the forefront of English politics during the reign of James I here on the left and Charles I there on the right as they're trying to lead England through this tumultuous period, not only in European history, but in England itself. Now, one of the more famous things that comes out from this time period is where a group of Catholics led by Guy Fawkes tries to blow up the Protestant Anglican king and the Protestant parliament with all its Anglican and Puritans in it. So the king meets parliament every single year on the same date. So Guy Fawkes and a couple other conspirators work to be able to try to blow them up by going and putting underneath the halls of parliament gunpowder. And it's something crazy. I forget off the top of my head here. Uh, This would have put not only like blown up all these guys and murdered them real good, but this would have put a crater in the heart of London along the Thames with how much gunpowder they had stored and put in there, and actually had that gunpowder in there. Now, the night before the meeting between the king and the parliament, one of the conspirators was tasked with guarding that, making sure that nobody go in there, basically saying, "Yeah, hey, King Semi in charge, move along, move along." Only one of the king's guards saw that the door was unguarded, was like, "Hey, what's going on?" Poked his nose in, saw the giant amounts of gunpowder in there, revealing this gunpowder plot, and then went and started to start the chain of events where all these guys were then uh, found, tried, found guilty, and then murdered. So this is Guy Fawkes here in the middle, who again is trying to lead this Catholic conspiracy against the Anglican Stuart kings and trying to literally blow them up. This was going to happen on November the 5th, and again, for the year is escaping me here, which is again becomes famous for being Guy Fawkes Day in England still to this day, where fireworks and effigies, so like straw kind of caricature scarecrows dressed as Guy Fawkes are set on fire to kind of show that that didn't happen. It becomes a kind of a fun thing. Have you seen the movie V for Vendetta? The Guy Fawkes mask that they wear in that graphic novel turned into a movie. Becomes kind of the anonymous hacker group also uses as kind of their nom de jour as well as the mask that they have in their videos. So still something that it outreaches and has an effect on us in various capacities today. So this power struggle is going to be between the king and parliament. And again, we're condensing and kind of just really hitting the top of the the issues that are percolating here. But on one side, we have the king. The king is going to have various tools at his disposal to be able to try to contain the power of parliament and be able to assert his absolute rule over England. So if England's in debt, England needs money. So how does he go and raise money? Well, one way he does that is by selling titles of nobility. You have all these guys, particularly the barons of England, who are making a ton of money in this great first international age of globalism and finance. They're making a ton of money. You've got guys who are going to the New World and making a ton of money in the Caribbean and to lesser extent the Americas. You can what you want to be. You want to be a nobleman, but you might not be able to have that title. You can go and buy that from the king, sell it to you for a pretty penny. Now you can become count this or lord that or duke here, which becomes a big deal, which raised money. But people are saying, well, no, this is supposed to be royal families and my family, so that's an issue. The king could force loans on some of these barons of London, of these financial magnates, to force them to give the king loans at interest rates and loan rates advantageous to the king, or if he would even have plans to pay them back, but under the threat of imprisonment or banishment or murder, he would do that. At various times, Charles I and James I dissolved Parliament, right, including an official dissolvement of Parliament to not allow them to meet so that this body doesn't exist and there's no longer a Parliament, so there's no longer a Parliament in the document Magna Carta, therefore the king now has absolute rule. To increase control over the countryside, he quartered soldiers, he increased martial law. The kings tried to persecute the Puritans, who are becoming the more well known agitators against the King of England and what he's doing. Again, the Puritans are a Protestant kind of branch of Calvinism in England who don't like the ostentatiousness and flashiness and wealth of the Anglican Church, which is an offshoot of the Catholic Church. And the king then begins to arrest opponents, throw them in dungeons, lock the door, and throw away the key and let them rot there. So that's what the king has at his disposal to try to be able to put Parliament and England under his control. Parliament fights back with its own tools. Parliament has what's called the power of the purse. This is outlined a little bit in Magna Carta 1215, where the king is not allowed to raise taxes without Parliament kind of doing that for him. Parliament has to raise taxes. The king can't just say, I'm raising taxes by $5. The king has to go to Parliament, ask for a increase in taxes, and since about 1215 to this time period, Parliament has rubber stamped these tax increases. Now, Parliament, upset with the king, has said no. No longer can you just do that. So if you need money for your own armies or to get back in Parliament or other stuff, you can't do that. You've got to raise it out yourself. And it's pretty darn tough to do to the King of England to raise money outside of Parliament's control. Parliament passes bills like the Petition of Right and the Triennial Bill to be able to go and say that Parliament is in the right, that the king doesn't have this bill, that Parliament has to keep meeting. Parliament worked to abolish the special courts. If the king is arresting opponents, he's doing that in own special royal courts. Parliament goes and gets rid of them. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop Laud, who had been working with the Anglican kings, is kind of exerting more control. Parliament is becoming more and more controlled by the Puritans. Parliament goes and tries the Archbishop under Parliament Court, and who's one of the buddies of Charles I, and Parliament executes this Archbishop within the Anglican Church and goes and makes its 19 proposition Parliament does to try to get the English king back under what Parliament views was its traditional role. So this major question of who's in charge of the government, is the king the outright divine right, absolute monarch of England and in control, or is Parliament a co-equal governing branch of the sovereignty of England? And this question is very much at the heart of this issue, and it's going to result in the solution to this question of the English Civil War. And the English Civil War is going to last from 1642 to 1649. And on one side are going to be royalists who support King Charles I. People who support the King of England are going to be called Cavaliers. Think about the Cleveland Cavaliers or the mascot for the University of Virginia. And against, obviously, the supporters of Parliament. Parliament is going to appoint Oliver Cromwell as the leader of its forces. So very simply, the English Civil War is between the king and his supporters and Parliament and their supporters. The supporters, the leader of the king's forces is the king, King Charles I. The leader of Parliament's forces is going to be Oliver Cromwell. The nickname for the royalists supporting the king are going to be the Cavaliers. The nickname for the supporters supporting Parliament are going to be called the Roundheads. By this point, a lot of people in England, particularly people critical of the king, have turned over into, have converted to Puritanism and become Calvinists within England. You don't want flashy haircuts, so they're called the Roundheads because basically they've got very simple haircuts. Think like bowl cuts. So if someone puts a bowl on a guy's head, any hair that's below the bowl chopped off. And so that's where they go and get their names from. Again, we're kind of up against the gun in terms of time and content. So for the most part, the English Civil War, like we saw, is in phases. First, the king here in the yellow does really well, so he's got stuff. Then Parliament can go fight back. But again, the big thing that happens is that the King Charles and his forces are going to lose, and the King Charles himself is going to get captured at the end of the war. So you can kind of go and see the fighting and the pikes and all the different stuff. This is what a soldier fighting for Parliament would have carried into battle during the English Civil War. Pretty fierce fighting, not a whole lot of fight. But again, Charles is then captured, is put under arrest, and then is signed to be executed by the leaders of Parliament and Oliver Cromwell. So here we can see that this guy is holding up the head of King Charles I amongst all these different people who are going and watching this. This is the outfit stained with his blood that King Charles had when he lost his head. I cannot emphasize how big of a deal this is because remember, why do kings get to rule? They get to rule because of God has appointed them. So if you are killing a king, you are going against God's wishes. So you better be darn sure that this king is not under God's auspices and is not going in and doing what you want, and God's actually on your side when you're going convicting and executing these kings. This is one of the first major times in Europe we've seen a king be executed by representatives of the people, by the lower classes. This is something that simply does not happen. You don't just go and murder kings. That's crazy. That's ridiculous. So this is a very big step in the power struggle over the governments of Europe, and particularly the kings and the people they govern the people. This is a major step towards working towards republics, republican democracies, and democracies that we see in our present stage. So, what do we have here? We've got Parliament as victors. Charles the First has lost his head. So, the ruler is of the government is now ostensibly Parliament. Parliament's still figuring out what's its goal, what's its role. So, Oliver Cromwell will eventually, over a couple of months in a year, establish a military dictatorship with him in charge, working in what he says Parliament's best interests. He's going to rule with a very strict Puritan morality. So even though the good thing he puts out religious toleration amongst the Catholics and Anglicans, Puritans, and other Protestants in England, but a lot of people are upset because they might not be Puritan, but they still have to go with no dancing and no bright clothes and all the other Calvinist stuff that they have there. He's going to die of what they think is malaria in 1658. His son is put in charge, but if we're doing the time period here, getting close to 20 years, third 10 years of all this fighting and killing, and the English are just flat out tired of military rule. Cromwell's son isn't that great, isn't that charismatic. So people in England begin to say, hey, you know what was great? Remember we had that king and how life was so much simpler? Why don't we go back to that? So the people of England begin to hunt down and search for and get messages out to Charles I's son, who will eventually become Charles II, who's living in hiding on the continent of Europe with relatives, so he doesn't get his head chopped off. And this is what's called the Restoration. And this is where England will restore its monarchy. Restoration is the return to rule by monarchy in England. Charles II is invited to come back and rule England. Now he's going to have to rule under Parliament's kind of dictates and other stuff. He's got to work a lot with Parliament, but he's still going to be the king. And again, it's good to be the king. Now, one of the things that Charles II has to rule under is certain laws. The most famous is that Parliament is going to pass the habeas corpus law in 1679. Now, habeas corpus is Latin for to have the body. And basically, what this law provides is that every prisoner, from the king to the lowest peasant, has the right to be brought before a judge to specify the charges against them. To simplify this further, The habeas corpus law means that prisoners cannot be held indefinitely without being brought to trial, where you can go before a judge and a jury, present your argument, and try to have the state present their argument to prove that you are guilty. Habeas corpus is one of the central fundamental laws in English common law to this day. It's one of the central fundamental laws we have in the United States, where again, if Mr. Cranmer is brought up against charges of speeding, I have the right to be brought before a judge and contest, well, maybe I wasn't speeding, or and they can say, so I have that right. So I have to know what charges I'm being charged with as an American today, and I can't just be thrown into jail and have the key and be locked up and have the key thrown away. So this is one of several laws that Parliament passes. This is the biggest and most consequential one in order for Parliament to agree to having a monarchy being restored in England. Charles II will die without an heir, and his crown is then going to go to his brother James, who now becomes James II of England. So there's Oliver Cromwell. Starts out as again being the savior of the people, being a ruler for Parliament, but again, this will devolve into military dictatorship and a re-invasion of Ireland. So he does some good things, does some bad things. You kind of got to decide for yourself how you want to feel about Cromwell. People are upset, though, with what Cromwell and Parliament are doing, so they invite Charles II to come back to England when Cromwell and then his son dies to restore the monarchy. And with great pomp and circumstance, the English monarchy is returned with some checks further on its power. So one of the checks on power is again the Habeas Corpus Act, which famously is one of the central tenets of American law. The United States really doesn't violate habeas corpus. It did it twice under Abraham. It did several times under Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and that's where we get the famous court cases of Ex parte Merriman and Ex parte Milligan, where the Supreme Court says, "No, Abraham Lincoln, you can't go and arrest newspaper editors and reporters who are angry with what you're saying and doing in the Civil War and throw them and lock them away." So that's again an example of that. The United States has famously violated the Guantanamo Bay detainees' right to habeas corpus because some of the guys they arrested in the couple of years after the 2001 attacks and the World Trade Center bombings, they still haven't brought to trial. It's now the year of our Lord 2023. President Barack Obama ran as one of his campaign promises in 2008 that he was going to go and release these prisoners from Guantanamo Bay, still keep at least bring them to trial. Some of these guys have been brought to trial, not all of them. So kind of not a great thing to kind of be in the United States is kind of account books. Finish up. James II is our last of our Stuart kings. James II begins to offend the English by appointing to Catholics to high positions. They're like, whoa, we don't want Catholics, we want Anglicans, we want Protestants, displaying his prominent Catholicism. Now, again, we've seen a little bit more religious toleration under Oliver Cromwell, but people were Parliament's thinking we want religious toleration, we don't want a Catholic ruler, and then has the audacity to have an infant son. And so if you're the people in Parliament, you are now looking at a Catholic ruler who now has a baby son to pass on his throne to, and who could have his own son, and the English are now terrified of having a line of Catholic rulers who for the past 150 years have been living outside of Catholic rule under the auspices of the Anglican and Puritan churches. So the people of England do not want, and again, variety of different things, but religion plays a major part of this, a Catholic king, and are like, maybe we don't want the Stuart kings anymore. So James has an infant son. He also has an older daughter, Mary, who is Protestant, who is married William of Orange, a Dutch Protestant of the county of Orange in the present-day Netherlands. So Parliament goes and acts, and what Parliament does is they invite William and Mary to overthrow James II for the sake of Protestantism. They get information and make an appeal to William of Orange, who is very wealthy, who has a sizable army under his control, to say, hey, you guys want to become the king and queen of England? They look at each other and they say, okay. So they sail from the Netherlands. William lands his army in 1688. goes to meet James II's army across the battlefield. James takes one look at this and says, nope, runs away. There's a little bit of fighting and a couple people die. And this then leads to what's called the Glorious Revolution. And this is the relatively, if we probably should put, oh, hold on, I got the pen out. Relatively, we'll put this in quotation marks, the relatively bloodless overthrow of James II and the new establishment of William and Mary's reign. So a couple people do die, but in terms of going from one ruling family to another in Europe for the time period, it's pretty bloodless. William and Mary agree to become the king and queen of England, but remember, they're only there because Parliament asked them to. And so they agree to rule England in a new form of government called a constitutional monarchy, where the supreme authority in England is no longer the absolute monarch, but the supreme authority in England is the law of England. And the William and Mary agree to govern under a constitution. They're in charge, but there are laws in place that limit the ruler's power. And the most famous set of those laws are drafted in 1689 when England creates its English Bill of Rights, which basically guarantees certain political and civil rights for every English citizen in the kingdom. This is going to be a big deal because the English Bill of Rights will become a forebearer, will become a foundational text of which the United States will base and write its Bill of Rights on nearly a century later in 1789. So here we have James II, who is ruling, and famously a Catholic ruler, which upsets the people of England, so much so that Parliament asks William and Mary of Orange to sail from the Netherlands to land in England to march their army towards the royal army. James flees, and William and Mary then become the new kings and queens of England. They now rule. It's a relatively bloodless overthrow, and again, they rule through under the auspices of a constitution with a English Bill of Rights built into it. So important to understand, and so that's how England and its political development has gone and shifted versus what's going on in the continent. And because England is seeing this shift in power where the absolute monarch is losing that power, it's going towards laws and representative bodies in parliament. We'll see how this has a major effect on the United States when it starts to, one, want to rebel during the Revolutionary War, as well as what does the United States want to build as their country when it's developed when they get to there. So that's going to end the small little section of this unit on the age of absolutism. And we're going to move into the Enlightenment era of European history in our next set of videos.